The Money Show.
Personal Finance with Warren Ingram.
22 minutes now to 8 the time. Time to speak to Warren Ingram, the co-founder of Galileo Capital and, of course, a registered financial planner, about some of the issues that he talks about, the sandwich generation. Warren, good evening. Good to hear from you as always. What is the sandwich generation? It's really about your age and stage in life.
It is, and you know, it's a global term referring to people who are somewhere in the age group of 30 to 60, and they find themselves in this position where they're looking after their own children and potentially some of their siblings and the like, and also then in a position where they're looking after their own parents. And so that they're sandwiched in the middle between the older and the younger generations, and they're in the middle of all of this, trying to raise their children, get them educated, at the same time trying to look after their parents who are not in a financial position to look after themselves. And we think it's a South African phenomenon because we often hear the phrase black tax, Stephen, and it's that it's a real thing. I'm not dismissing it, but it's actually a global phenomenon, and it seems to be really in this age group of people who are 30 to 60 and are struggling under a phenomenal financial pressure.
I mean, I suppose in a way, in many cases, it's one generation of people looking after two generations of people. That's why it's so tough.
Absolutely, and the pressure is enormous. If you consider, let's say a 50-year-old whose parents are not financially capable of looking after themselves, the last thing any child wants to do is to let their parents suffer in their older age, and so the children of older people will do whatever they can to look after their parents at a stage where things like medical costs will be going up. But at the same time, these parents are in a position where they need to raise their children and educate them, and that's almost every parent's prerogative, and I guess big drive is how do we do the best for our children? So they really are struggling, and then of course there's the small matter of their own financial independence at some point. They would also like to retire and not be a burden on their parents. So it's an enormous amount of pressure from all directions in a time where economies are not doing so well. It's tough out there, Stephen.
Sure. All right. Your first step: create a comprehensive budget. I should have known you would start here.
The dreaded B word, but now I'm adding comprehensive to it just to make it seem different. So I think understanding that you need to get a broader picture of your expenses than just your own. So it's also understanding what are the costs that we're liable for our parents, and what are the costs that we need to cater for our children. And then understanding how those are working now, and then just looking a little bit into the future, understanding that, for example, medical aid, costs, they escalate quite a bit quicker than inflation. Despite what we hear from medical aids, that's the reality, is that medical aid inflation is significantly faster than CPI. So you need to get a grip on that, and you need to understand if any of your parents have particular medical conditions that might require extra funding, and then at the same time getting a grip on the education costs that you might be paying now for your children, but particularly into the future. So it's a case of understanding your reality. I mean, for some people, it's something that they would avoid because it might be a little bit depressing and a little bit scary, and that's true. But gee, the one thing that's much more scary than the realistic picture of your expenses is your imagined expenses, and the fear of the unknown is far greater usually than the fear of the reality. So it's critical to get an understanding of what's going on and what you're spending, and then, if possible, look at your expenses and see if there are any where you can cut back and without really significantly compromising on the necessities. Is there anything that you can do that will reduce expenses and keep all the generations as happy as possible?
And of course, the other thing is to communicate quite openly about it. Everyone needs to know where you are.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a morbid point, but suicide rates for people in this situation are particularly high, and it's because they're in this incredible position of pressure, and they don't want to let anybody down, and so they sit with this, building pressure that they can't escape, and very often they find themselves in a situation where they start to accumulate debt. They start to accumulate personal loans and credit cards because they don't want to let anybody down, and unfortunately that pressure builds enormously, and without explaining to everyone around you what's going on, it's very difficult to get the help that you need, if you're in this position. And the help that you need might just simply be a communication. If you've got parents who maybe, didn't get, kind of tertiary education, don't really understand the financial system very well, they might think the fact that you've got a job makes you wealthy, and they might think that money is reasonably unlimited. And so it's important to sit them down to say, okay, we need to understand your position. We need to understand your expenses, any income that you've got from pensions and grants and the like. But here is my income. These are my expenses, and this is what I need to spend on feeding my family and educating them, etc. And then as a collective, you start to make better decisions, and the moment you share their emotional load, I feel it makes a huge difference. But it starts with being brave enough to sit down with everybody and have a very open conversation, and it must be done as early as possible. And for a lot of families, this is such an awkward thing to do, to kind of share your income and expenses information with your parents. Lots of adults don't want to do that, but that's the reality. You have to do that because your parents might be your financial responsibility as well, and if they don't understand, they might just think that you're being horrible to them, or you're depriving them when you don't necessarily need to do that. And I think the emotional side of this is enormous, and you can share that emotional load and make better, more rational decisions when everybody's part of the conversation.
You also are suggesting that you should plan for healthcare, and particularly with older parents and with children.
I mean, in my work environment, I'm in that phase where I've got lots of my colleagues having babies, and that's the one universal comment from all of them is that having children is much more expensive than they thought, and they're in financial services. You think they would know better, Stephen, but that's their reality. Is that having children is an expensive thing, and so. Make sure that if you're in a position where you're considering children, plan for those healthcare costs. Make sure you've got the correct medical aid. Whatever medical aid you've got, it's never going to cover everything. So make sure that you've got health insurance as well. And then looking at your parents, understand what they have. Do they have some form of medical aid, and make sure that they don't cancel that when they're trying to get their budget right, because their healthcare costs could spiral out of control very quickly. And the one thing about healthcare is it's almost like Russian roulette. You could be planning and everything's going okay, and you get that one massive kind of medical shock, and it just destroys all financial, any kind of budget or any kind of reserves that you've got, because the costs are just so enormous. And the only way that you can protect against that is to make sure that you've got the correct cover and the correct insurances. But that doesn't happen unless you know what's going on with everybody and what everybody has, and you've done the planning correctly. So it's almost 360-degree healthcare planning, for yourself, because you can't ignore your own medical needs, and then for your parents and your children as well.
You also suggest that you actually need to prioritize your own retirement, and what you want to avoid is your children being in the same position that you're in now.
So it's one of my favorite sayings is, when we get on an airplane and we all diligently listen to the airline stewards tell us about the health and safety processes. One of the things they make very clear is that if there is an issue and the plane loses oxygen, these masks will drop down from the top of the roof, and the first thing you do is you put the mask on yourself before you help anybody else. That's not being selfish. That's not an act of narcissism or anything like that. That's putting yourself in the very best position so that you can help those around you. And And that's what you absolutely have to do when it comes to your own retirement savings. The financial pressure of people who haven't saved correctly for retirement only gets worse, and it has an enormous impact on their own emotions. It has an impact on those around them. And so, while you might feel that you're shielding everybody from the worries that you have, that they certainly will feel it. And at some point, if the money runs out, then you sit in a position where you kind of become the next part of the sandwich generation to your children, something you definitely want to avoid. And so it's making sure that you've done your planning correctly and that you do set aside some money, on a monthly basis for yourself. And I would add, we've spoken about retirement savings. Definitely, you have to have an emergency fund in a situation like this as well, because without the emergency fund, I absolutely promise you the emergency happens. And it's amazing how often people who have emergency funds don't have emergencies. I don't know why, but that's how it works.
Sure. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Also, you've got to educate the next generation. I mean, it's about making sure that your children are in a better position than you are because they've been able to plan for it better.
So that that open communication that I spoke about a bit earlier, it lands here as well. When your means are limited and everybody's under financial pressure, it's difficult for younger children to understand that. And so getting them involved in kind of very preliminary financial planning conversations is extremely useful. One, because it gives them a better idea of what's actually happening in the family. But number two, it starts to involve them in financial decision making. It starts to help them understand those trade-off decisions that we all have to make in life. We would like to go to some fancy holiday. That's great, but at the same time, we need to have transport to get to work and school and all of those things. So we can do the one or the other, but we can't do both. And how are we going to make that decision? And so when your children are very young, you need to give them, I guess, very simple trade-off decisions. But as they get older, and I think very early high school is a great time to start, you can start to involve them in more and more complex parts of your financial decision-making. If you do that, and you do that with a child that's 13 years old, by the time they're 21, they've had, 8 years of training alongside you and real life experience about how this works. So when they enter the workplace, hopefully they've studied and they start working, they have a very good idea of what's going on and what they should be doing. And that's a phenomenal gift to give them. You might not be able to give them much of a financial head start, but you can give them an 8-year real financial education that potentially you didn't get and almost certainly your parents didn't get.
Sure. All right. Warren, there's a question from George for you, Warren. We'll get to it in a sec. Here's the question. The local stock market's been doing very well lately, and hasn't it? I wonder if now is the time to allocate more funds to the local markets and reduce offshore investments. What should I do? Is this the right thing to do? Basically, to reduce your offshore exposure. We'll have an answer for you, George, in just a moment. 9 minutes stayed.
The Money Show. Personal finance with Warren Ingram.
And continuing with Warren, there was a question from George, Warren, about whether or not this is the right time to actually allocate more money to the local market and reduce offshore investments. And Warren, look, I mean, the US has been doing very well, but our JSE's been doing very well too.
I can't. I can believe it, but I suspect if we were chatting a year ago, before the South African elections, while load shedding was still a thing, and I'd said to you, Stephen, we're going to get more than 25% return from the top 40 index in South Africa, you might have had me committed to a mental asylum. And that's the reality of markets, is they surprise you. And so I love the question, because it means that we're starting to look at the JSE as a source of growth again, and that's very healthy. It's a very rational thing to do. I think we need to be careful about why we're moving our money around. So, I always maintain you should have exposure to the local and the global markets, and it should be in proportion for your life. In other words, your financial position dictates how much you have in the South African market and in global markets. And so looking at what's done well and what's done poorly isn't necessarily an indicator of when you decide to move money between SA and global. What you should be looking at is to say, if the global part of your portfolio has grown much faster than the local part and your balance is now skewed, then by all means consider bringing some of that money back to South Africa to get the balance right. But if you're looking at doing this almost as a trading position to say, something is done well, it's generated more than 25% over the last 12 months. I want to see if I can ride that tiger for the next 12 months, and I'm going to almost trade, and be opportunistic. I would caution against that. The reality is, none of us have a clue what the JSE is going to do in the next 12 months. I think it might do very well, but that's a belief rather than a certainty. And the American market is very expensive, and maybe it won't do well over the next 12 months. But we could all be surprised. And so rather get your balance right, George, and make sure that you use these big market events to help you get a good balance between local and global. But I wouldn't be a trader. I think that's the wrong thing to do.
I mean, as always, for you, it's about diversification. You've got to get that balance right. It's all about that, as always.
Yeah, and it's such an easy thing to tell you on air while we're having this lovely conversation. But when you see something that's delivering, fantastic returns, it's so tempting to try and take advantage. That fear of missing out on the next 25% is very difficult to fight. So you have to be clear with yourself and very firm to say, potentially your balance should be 50% SA, 50% global. If you're currently sitting at 40% SA and 60% global, by all means, use this time to get that balance right. But if you're sitting at 50-50, then I'm going to say to you, George, stay the course and see how things unfold, because you will be surprised to the positive and the negative. We just don't know which is going to happen first.
You've been talking about the sandwich generation, people who have to look after their children and their parents. And one of the things you suggest actually is, considering the complexity of it and the sheer stress of it, it's actually something where you should seek professional help.
Yeah, I think it's, it might be as detailed as actually having a family counseling session where you actually get a professional counselor to help you talk through these issues. It might be very difficult for one person to kind of take responsibility for this and to have these very big open conversations, which are going to be very difficult, and no one's going to be happy. And so it might be that you get a life coach or a psychologist to help you have a facilitated conversation, and it removes some of that pressure. If the family's all in line and you share the goals, it might be that you need to get some professional help around your tax strategies and your actual financial planning around the medical care and those things. Don't be scared to go and pay someone for a bit of advice. Pay for an hour or two to help you with these things. I think it's just the message I really want to share tonight is don't try and deal with this all on your own. It's phenomenal pressure, and you really aren't alone. There are lots of people in a similar position to you. And the worst outcome here is that you take a drastic course of action with your own life, feeling that you're useless. You're not. Lots of people in the same position.
It sometimes, it's the biggest fundamental human question is, am I normal? Are there other people like me? And the answer is, in almost every case, yes.
Yeah, we like to, when things are going well, we like to feel special and unique, and we all have some form of being unique. But when times are tough, and we all feel useless and as the only ones that are struggling with this, and I know I'm privileged to share those conversations with lots of people, and lots of people are struggling, and lots of people that you think are phenomenally successful are having a struggle, but put on a good face. So don't be afraid to ask for help and to talk to those around you. You'll be surprised how willing people are to help and share the load with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Warren Ingram. Always good to hear from you. Co-founder of Galileo Capital and, of course, a registered financial planner. The perils of the difficulties, the stress, and how to survive being a member of the sandwich generation.